Hello, everyone. This is the Know Your Place podcast, and this is episode 5. On this week's episode, Sarah Antel joins me from the Dove Party podcast, and I propose a Great Lakes culture hegemony. Yes, a hegemony, or as I like to call it, the Great Lakes Supremacy. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone. This is the Know Your Place podcast. I'm Charles Altendorf, and this is episode 5. Wow, 5 episodes. And on this week's episode, I have a very special guest. Her name is Sarah Antel. Say hello, Sarah.
Hi, everyone.
And she actually is another podcaster. She hosts the wonderful podcast, The Dove Party.
Yes, that's us.
Yes. And that's on SoundCloud as well, so you should check it out. Now, what's the general format of your podcast?
Yeah, well, thank you for this plug and letting me shamelessly plug myself here. The Dove Party is a general format for us. We do what we call seasons. We're about to start season 4 in April, so we're on a little bit of a hiatus. And it is me and 3 other goofballs, and we like to sit around and talk story on different political topics of the day. So ranging from breaking headlines to dumb things our political parties said to bigger picture things like debating, abortion access or the separation of church and state. And we do that all by respectfully chatting with each other. We all come from different political backgrounds, and hearing each other out and having our opinions challenged, sometimes changed. And we also like to crack some really bad dad jokes on the show and sit around. And I've been known to drink a vodka soda or a beer while doing the podcast. So we just generally have fun and make politics approachable and not so nasty as it has been lately.
Well, that is a very admirable cause that I don't know if I have the fortitude to indulge in to that level.
Thanks, I know.
Anyway, so on this week's episode, though, I kind of wanted to cross over between the geopolitical, although it probably won't be quite as intense as your show. But this week I'm proposing something totally absurd, and I expect to get tons of weird comments and people like you're crazy. But I'm proposing a different kind of supremacy or hegemony than most people ever propose. And although, probably using the word supremacy was quite intense to start it, but I don't really know what other word to use. I want to reinvigorate Great Lakes culture. I think it's dying. So we're gonna jump off from that point a little on this week's podcast. All right. So first things first, because I'm a sort of scholar on these things. I don't know if I'm a scholar. I'm a geographer. I do have a geographical perspective, but I'm always interested what the layman thinks, because to me, half of the understanding of place is what the average person thinks of place. So I'm going to start with you and sort of see what your preconceived notion is of what the Great Lakes is and what its culture and peoples are. So here you go. Go ahead.
I'm going to start this off by saying I move a lot, and I have never lived in this region of the U.S., not yet at least. So
that blows my mind. Although it is dying. That is part of the premise here.
This is true. So my idea of the culture of the Great Lakes, at least my preconceived notions here, is that it is kind of cold, that people are generally really friendly. I kind of think of that Midwestern vibe where everyone's generally really nice and sweet, and they cook casseroles, and I'm just really stereotyping here.
No, this is great. This is good. Keep going.
I don't know. This might be off to a bad start. So they're very friendly and cooking casseroles, and they have decent beer, and it's cold, and people like hockey, which I'm a big hockey fan, and And a lot of people, some of maybe the main industries outside of like Chicago would be more of the manufacturing, like almost Rust Belt type of stuff. So I'm looking forward to you correcting me on all of this.
Oh no, that was actually very perfect. It's actually very funny you say this casserole stereotype. In one of Ray Bradbury, I'm sure you know who Ray Bradbury is, don't you? He wrote Fahrenheit 451, but he also wrote a bunch of short stories called The Martian Chronicles, and they're about colonizing Mars. Well, in one of his short stories, my wife turned me on to this. There's one where they try and colonize Mars. These astronauts go to Mars, and they get there, and the aliens lure them into this town by making it appear like their hometown. And it's like stereotypical Midwestern, and they lure them into a false sense of security and then kill them all. But
goodness.
So apparently Ray Bradbury was reaching for this too, this stereotype.
Yeah.
So when I think of the Great Lakes region, I kind of define it as, in geography, we kind of have this concept called a cultural hearth, if that makes sense. So, like, there's an area that's like the strongest focal point of the culture, and then it kind of expands outward from there. Mm. So, like, if you were to say what is the hearth of sort of the Great Lakes, and I like to call it the Great Lakes instead of the Midwest, because the Midwest term is kind of, it's so hard to tell where that ends and begins with anyone anymore. But I'm kind of pro-Wisconsinite, as everybody who knows me knows. But I visualize the Great Lakes region as being an overarching sort of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, kind of, those are the hearth, and then, like, the influence expands outward. You can see some of it in Chicago and, even parts of Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. But it's not quite as strong as it is when you think of places like Detroit, or sort of Minnesota and things like that. So I'm a Laker. I don't know how to describe it. But yeah, Chicago, I guess I'll take that back. I'll include Chicago in the hearth because Chicago is the biggest city in the Great Lakes. So there's what I see as the stereotype as that. So now, as we go along with that, why I say that the culture from there is dying, or I kind of opened with that premise, is there used to be all kinds of shows and movies about this area, and I don't think there's as many new ones coming out like that. Like, I don't know what kind of shows you grew up with, but, obviously in the 80s there was Happy Days about Milwaukee, and then and then my parents' hometown was featured in Step by Step, which is about Port Washington, Wisconsin. But then if you get in sort of in the 90s, there was stuff like Family Matters and Home Improvement and things like that. And those are kind of like the pillars of showing it to the rest of the world. There's like an ideal, right? We're shooting for this. This is what America looks like. It looks like these places, right? And I just don't see that as often anymore. The last show that really that took place in the Midwest, I can remember that was big, was Parks and Rec.
Oh yeah, okay. But it was a made-up town, so I'm not. Yeah,
it was made up, but it was supposed to be set in Indiana. It was supposed to be like Muncie or something, I guess. But again.
Oh, okay.
So I guess if we want to sort of hit on the next sort of part of the subject I was going to talk about is sort of why I think it's. You were talking about this sort of thing with casseroles and friendly people, right? And
yeah.
That's what I think is sort of missing today, and why it's sad that it's dying, is that, like, so I don't know if you know much of the history of Wisconsin, but, like, my grandparents went to the same college where the Republican Party was started, in Ripon, Wisconsin.
Oh.
And it was originally started as an anti-slavery party, right? But alongside that, you have places like Madison And then the John Birch Society is also from Wisconsin. So there's quite a, I don't know how to describe it. It's like different groups of people are allowed to live together there in the Midwest. And I feel like other regions of the country are more balkanized, if you will. So I was I was going to get your theories on that. So before I keep expanding on mine.
Yeah, that is, that's really interesting. As I mentioned, I haven't gone to the region enough. I went to Wisconsin for the first time a couple weeks ago for work, actually.
Oh, well, there you go.
And I went to Middleton, Wisconsin, if people know where that is. And I mean, it was covered in snow, and it was really interesting. I remember remarking to my coworkers on the flight in, I was excited because I guess this plays back into my stereotypes of the Great Lakes region. I didn't mention this earlier, but it was the first time I'd ever seen frozen lakes in real life. And I thought that was like a stereotypical like Great Lakes region. Like you all have a bunch of little lakes up there and they freeze and you can like skate on them or play hockey or whatever.
Right,
and so I was really excited to see those in real life flying in. But anyway, it's interesting that you mention the ability for different types of people to live there and that you see that as dying and maybe that's not so commonplace in other parts of the U.S. And I thought that was really interesting because I both agree and disagree. I feel like I could see where you're coming from. For example, I lived in Hawaii, probably 8 years ago now. And I lived on the Big Island, which I absolutely loved. And it was interesting because while, anyone can live there, right? Like you're free to move there if you so choose. It was really interesting seeing myself as a minority for the first time because I'm white. That was a really interesting experience. It's primarily Asian.
Right.
Native Hawaiians obviously still live there, but their numbers are dwindling. It's kind of similar to on the mainland, the native populations here. The numbers are dwindling and they're kind of pushed aside instead of on reservations, Hawaiian homelands. And I'm not the most qualified to speak on this, but you get my point.
I get your idea.
Yeah, you get the train of thought. So it was interesting for me. Like, obviously, I lived there and I loved it and I would go back. And but it was interesting to just see a different type of culture, I guess, be the norm and what I was not used to. And just a different way of kind of doing everything. Like the language, Hawaiian Pidgin is actually Hawaiian Creole English.
Interesting.
That's like the way most people speak. And it was just like, so I could see it both ways. And I feel like Hawaii is a good example of, yes, I disagree because you can live anywhere. But at the same time, like you have a lot more adjusting to do in certain parts of the country versus just maybe how it is in the Great Lakes. And so I don't know, I just thought that could be an interesting counterexample to the Great Lakes region. But everyone should go visit the Big Island and don't just take my word for it. But it was a unique experience to just see how different that was over there.
Well, and I bring that up because I more see it as the contrast to sort of like the East Coast. I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina for a little while. And there I'm not saying this is all over the East Coast, but it just seemed like there was a lot of gated communities and like a lot of people just stayed in their places. And I'm not saying this doesn't happen in the Great Lakes, okay? But like, like even in the beaches, like my wife and I go up to northern Indiana to go to the beach at the Indiana Dunes on Lake Michigan. And I mean, there's rich people, there's poor people, there's all kinds of people. Lots of the rich neighborhoods in Chicago, I mean, they don't have gated communities quite like that, and especially in Wisconsin, there's no, I don't know, maybe there is, somebody will find a counterexample and post it, but, it just seems very accessible. And when I was out in the East Coast, like, not everyone can use the beach, some people have very, strong fences cordoning off their bit of the beach, or...
Yeah, that's interesting.
So, and I think that plays into the politics in a way, and why it's sort of like, I don't know how to describe it. I always tell people I feel like in the Midwest, where other people keep trying to convince us that their argument is right. You know?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we should probably just, we could be left alone sometimes. You know? Unfortunately, you can't be totally left alone, but, you know,
Sure.
I don't know. So that's where I'm kind of going with this episode.
Okay.
Is that I feel like, I don't know how to describe it. It's not that I would say that the Midwest is necessarily totally integrated or something,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like it's okay for other groups to just exist alongside each other in ways it's not. Even in the West Coast, I hear, like, I've been hearing a lot of stories about California now with their massive homeless camps everywhere, and you know how people in rural California have a total different view than urban California, you know?
Oh, yeah. That's something. I live on the West Coast, excuse me, right now. I've only been out here for less than 2 years, and that was something I just assumed. You know, California, Oregon, Washington was all like, quote unquote, the left coast, and all very like left-leaning politics and Democrats and wealthier, you know, like all the stereotypes. And the reality is it's like that along I-5, the main interstate that runs up and down the West Coast, where a lot of the population lives. But once you get east of I-5 and you get into more of the rural areas, the mountainous areas, people just think completely differently, and they really do not like having their politics dictated by the people on the coast. And I never knew that before I moved here. And I just think it's an interesting observation that you bring up. Like, once you get past a certain part, they do not think the same. It is not.
And I'm not saying that people in the Midwest do, because, I mean, obviously if you met somebody in rural Indiana, they'd be different than somebody in Chicago. But I think we have to get along a little more, like we have to. Because, you know, there's not like, I don't know how to describe it. It's not like one group of people's politics can just overwhelm somebody all the time. Like, Milwaukee's had socialist mayors, but at the same time, Wisconsin had Senator Joe McCarthy. So, it's, you know, it's just like, it's one group of people's ideology never dominates. And, I don't know, I kind of wish the rest of America was like that, because I feel like we're trending in a different direction.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. I think that's a really interesting point, because I agree with you. I think that a diverse set of opinions and ideas is really important in crafting the city, the state, the country, the world, whatever that you want to live in. One party or one set, like, groupthink isn't the answer, and it shouldn't affect everyone. I think we're better off if we have all those opinions compromising and working together, and it's kind of a give and take. And so I agree where I can see different factions, if you will, kind of trying to dominate others. And it's funny because I was trying to like prep and like think about this episode, and I could really see it going either way. I feel like if you're more of a conservative thinker, like you could argue that liberals are pushing their views on everyone else. But I feel like on the flip side, I know a lot of liberals think, you know, the GOP controls all three branches of government. And now, you know, so it's so interesting that like we can live in the same country and have the same like layout in front of us and interpret it completely differently.
And the contrast I see for the Great Lakes region to that is that, you know, while there are laws that are pushed, you know, like obviously people think that Walker's gone a bit far in Wisconsin and, you know, things like that. There's largely still just these strong-held beliefs of, I don't know how to describe it, just like openness and things that I just don't think are rooted as strongly everywhere else. Like a great example is even here in Indiana, they have open primaries, right?
Yeah.
And they don't have that most other places, right?
Right.
You know, and they do in Wisconsin and Michigan as well, I believe. But, you know, that's a testament to how open it is here, that people, even no matter what their sort of cultural views are, they think that everyone should have a chance to have their voice on the stage. And that goes back, I think, a bit to, even if we want to get all fuzzy-eyed about Illinois with Abe Lincoln and who was he always debating? Stephen Douglas, back in the early days before he became president, right? And again, that's just I think that's kind of a Great Lakes value, and I think it's getting lost a bit. So that's what I think about that. So to me, it's not, because people always say, well, the reason why this last one swung was that, there's a bunch of quote-unquote deplorables in flyover country, right? But I don't really believe that the Midwest, or the Great Lakes region, is sort of ultra-conservative. I don't think that that's the hallmark of it. I think it's that everybody... I think a conservative and a liberal in the Midwest can live side by side and never really get to the point that they're just super crazy mad at each other. Like on my Facebook feed, I have libertarians and socialists, and we all live in the same town.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know. I just don't see that interplay as well in the West Coast or the East Coast, for that matter. In New York, it's very much on display, the disparity for some people, Of course, I haven't been... Yeah. I've been to New York only once, and I've been to Philadelphia once. I've also been to D.C. once. All those weren't when I was younger. The thing I remember about New York City is just, feeling overwhelmed by the crowds, but I don't know. It's really weird, because Chicago's a big city, but it does not feel as overwhelming as New York or Philadelphia.
Yeah, there's just something about New York. I know what you mean. It is really interesting. I think that's a notion that a lot of people hold, is like the coasts, whether it's the West Coast or the East Coast, kind of hold the power in the national conversation, and their views might dictate, like, quote, the flyover states or the Midwest or the South.
Well, and I would even say that, like, to some degree, even Texas holds sway too. Just, again.
Oh yeah.
Like, and a lot of people don't know. I'm gonna burst some people's minds here on this podcast, but the Bush family actually isn't really from Texas. They were originally from Maine. They're New Englanders, and so I kind of see it a lot as like this big East Coast money is coming in here to my Midwest, trying to influence what I'm going to do or something, which I admit is kind of nuts, but it feels that way. It really feels that way sometimes, whether it's right-wing or left-wing, whereas I just want to live here in the Midwest and enjoy what's great about it, or the Great Lakes region. Correct myself on my own podcast. But I don't know, is that a crazy view? Am I just like crazy, or do I just see it from a totally crazy mindset?
I think you just really like where you live, which is a really good thing, obviously. It's a great thing. I think it sounds like you're very deeply rooted in your community, and I think people ought to aspire to that. I think that's wonderful. It's funny, though. I wouldn't say that I think don't get me wrong, you've sold me on spending more time in the Great Lakes region for sure. But I don't know that I would say, like, it is the greatest region, just because I can see where you're coming from and, how the coast might dominate politics. But people on the coast can argue the flip side and say the flyover states where the populations are a lot lower, maybe with the
electoral college. Yeah,
exactly. So, like, but that's kind of the thing. You can always argue the other side, right? You can always kind of flip it and see what the other side might say. But
the Great Lakes, though, have always been the swing states. They're not. You can't say that Wisconsin or Michigan or even Minnesota, are totally sewn up every election. You don't know what's going to happen. They don't have an allegiance.
You're right. That is very true, and it keeps it very interesting. And I'm guessing that's due in large part to what you have talked about on your show today so far, is that there's a lot of different pockets of people that peacefully coexist with each other, and they think very differently from each other, and that's why you can't really predict which way they're going to go.
Right. Like I before the election, I had some vague notions that I thought Trump was going to win in Michigan, because I've been to the UP and I saw all Trump signs, which very much shocked me, because that used to be a very Democratic area, but I had no idea Wisconsin was going to flip or Minnesota was going to be close. So, in fact, Wisconsin was very weird. 12% of the vote was crossover vote between Obama and Walker. I'd be really interested to meet somebody who voted for both, because that's a very stark contrast, in my opinion.
It is. Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I could talk about this for hours. So, but I won't go into that. But I know we only have so much time, but it is really fascinating because you saw a lot of that. And I mean, a lot of what was called, quote unquote, the blue wall in those states, where people had voted for Obama twice in the presidentials, 2008 and 2012, and then flipped and voted for Trump. And on the surface, you're like, wow, those are two very different things. And they still are. But I just think it's so interesting that that can happen. But it just goes to show you, like, you can't put people in a box. And from what you've told me about this Great Lakes region, like, people think very differently. And, you know, maybe those same people just changed their minds, or maybe their neighbors were talking to them. That's one of the most powerful things in politics, actually, is neighbors talking to neighbors and convincing them to vote a certain way.
I think another thing is that they're also, again, I guess it's probably that general skepticism as well. You know, I don't know how far it goes, you know, with some people. I'm much more cynical and skeptical probably than the average person. But I think there's probably a bunch of people who are just skeptical and fed up, and that's what happened. But it's still mind-blowing to think it went that far. Like,
sure. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. I mean, obviously hindsight is 20/20, and you can learn a lot of things now and kind of dissect what went wrong and all that jazz. But yeah, it's really interesting, and I think it's what you said. People were just fed up. A lot of that region was the Rust Belt. A lot of those jobs have disappeared over the years. Unfortunately, they're not coming back, and it's just, who is going to listen to me? Here is this, like, bat out of hell. Sorry if we can't swear on the show. And
I have hell in another recording. I still put clean. So.
Okay. On my show, we have the explicit rating on iTunes because I can't contain myself. So.
I don't know. I don't know. See, this is a funny cultural difference. When I grew up, saying "what the hell" was not swearing.
Oh.
And apparently for a lot of people that is, so I don't know. We'll see if I get revoked after that.
I wasn't allowed to say shut up in my house growing up, which probably is why I swear so much as an adult.
Although I have to say, I'm in a geography group on Facebook, and Canadians, they swear a whole bunch. It's
really?
Like every other word. I'm like, goodness gracious. They're just like, F this and F that, and I'm like, whoa!
How funny. Okay, so I have a question for you. Can I ask you a question on your own podcast?
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
So, a lot of the states in the Great Lakes region are obviously very close and or neighbors to Canada. So do you see a lot of Canadian influence in that region?
I would say to a degree, yes. Actually, I recently found out, studying my ancestors a little more, well, recently I say I found it out probably 4 years ago, that two different lines of my ancestors actually immigrated from Canada. So one of them immigrated from Germany to Canada and then through Buffalo to Wisconsin. Don't explain that one to me. And then another one we think actually came from Newfoundland and settled in, have you ever heard of Door County, Wisconsin?
No.
Door County is that peninsula that sort of sticks out of the northeast corner. And that peninsula is called Door because they said boating on it was like being on death's door because it's so treacherous. But
what?
So it's very bizarre to me that a family immigrated to Door County from Canada in the 1800s. But who knows? That branch of the family also had the great grandfather that was a pool shark and liked to sell extra rations during World War II. So
it's fascinating.
Yeah, there is a bit of Canadian influence. And when I was there, when I go up there, my cell phone thinks I'm in Canada. It's like, do you want to do international calling or?
Sure don't.
But yes, and Sarah, when I took my wife there, she said, "Man, everybody here sounds Canadian to me," because she's from Kentucky. So, Yeah, actually,
Okay.
when I first was living in, even when I was living in Cincinnati, people would say my accent sounded northern, implying that I was some kind of Canadian or something. So I recently did an accent test from the New York Times, and it put me in Aurora, Illinois, which is like 100 miles from where I was born. So it was pretty accurate.
That's interesting. I've moved a whole bunch, so I'd be curious to know what if I have an accent, where like the bits and pieces that influenced it and stuff. So
I
I'll
don't
give
know.
that a go.
I always thought that it would sound more southern at some point because I've actually lived south of the Mason-Dixon line longer than north of it, but I don't know. I guess it doesn't. I also had a South African immigrant tell me I had the perfect American accent, which I don't really know what that means, but
But thank you.
yes. So yeah, I do see it sometimes though. Like, obviously they play hockey up there, right?
Yeah.
And then, well, I like listening to some Canadian shows. Like I like, well, the Bare Naked Ladies were really popular up there, and they're from Canada.
Oh, yeah.
So, and my wife really likes the Red Green Show, and I like that a lot too, and that's from Canada. And then I used to listen to this radio host named Gian Gomeshi, but he kind of got into trouble with a lot of scandals, so. But yeah, so there's a little bit of influence, but I would almost say it's also goes the other way too, that the Canadian side of the border was influenced by the Great Lakes as well. Because a part of the I don't know how to, the dividing line today between the U.S. and Canada in the region is pretty arbitrary compared to how it was settled. Because a lot of people don't know this, Wisconsin was, while it is predominantly German now, from the 1800s influx, the original settlers of Wisconsin were French Canadians that settled south. And Green Bay used to be a fur trapping town. And it used to have French people in it. And so there's the whole Great Lakes Basin is kind of its own culture in a way. Although people in Toronto I don't really consider the same. I don't know, maybe I need to spend more time in Toronto.
That's funny.
So it goes both ways, but yeah, to a degree. But there is something uniquely American too about our side. Wisconsin and Minnesota in particular, well, more so Wisconsin, but Minnesota too. It's not quite as easy to access Canada from those two places. Minnesota not because there's a long border with Canada, but it's just so remote up there, nobody ever goes up that way. And then Wisconsin actually doesn't touch Canada in any spots. So you have to go through Michigan or Minnesota to get to Canada's land. So Wisconsin is really weird, but the rest of the Great Lakes region, yeah, I don't know. There's an influence, but I don't know. I do feel different than Canadians. There's things I don't like that Canadians like, And they have this weird obsession with thinking they won the War of 1812. So that's weird. Seriously, I tutored one. They're like, "We won the War of 1812." She was from Toronto. So.
Huh.
Yeah.
How odd.
Yeah, and my wife was working at this historic house down in Kentucky, and I don't know if you know who Ranger Gord was from the Red Green Show, but they sent him down because he was doing they were doing a documentary on this guy in Kentucky who had fought in the War of 1812 and died in Canada. It's like a big deal to them over there. I don't know why.
That is so weird. But hey, okay, sure.
But as for influencing the politics and the culture, yes, not so much the politics.
Gotcha.
I think Canadians, the type of Canadians that live in Ontario, I would say are more left-leaning on average than the general Great Lakes person.
Okay.
I mean, I guess. I don't know. Trudeau, he's pretty left-leaning. I don't know where he, I don't know where he came from. I don't know where most of his vote came from. I'm not the best versed on Canadian politics. I would assume to win an election in Canada, you would have to win like Vancouver and Toronto, win most of those votes, and then, I don't know what the swing state would be in Canada. I guess Quebec.
I'm not well versed enough, but I imagine it's similar to here where you have like your big pockets that you need to grab, and then the rest is kind of gravy.
But they do have socialized medicine there, so I guess they are more left-leaning in general. I don't know, it's weird because I think of Canada as more rural than the Great Lakes side of the border, right? Because there's more city centers, but it seems like it's a little more conservative on the Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan side in the politics. So I don't know.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, I think if you like zoom out, I guess, and look at the world, um, you know, our country is not the most liberal. Sure, we have a more liberalized economy than a lot of different countries, but in terms of like our politics and our culture, I think you're right. Like just in your example of comparing Canada to us right there in the Great Lakes region, I think we are more conservative than a lot of our friends in Canada and Europe for sure.
Although I will say the thing that when I think of something that's similar to Canada from that side is environmentalism is a big deal in Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota, even in the rural communities. So, so I would say that's a big thing. Environmentalism doesn't seem to be as big when I cross the Ohio River. So, like in Wisconsin, there's like all these different recycling bins. Well, Michigan's the worst. You got to have like 4 or 5 recycling bins.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but they pay you 10 cents for a bottle. So hey, in some places.
Yeah, well, that's how Oregon is. Of course, they charge you for it first. They charge you an extra 10 cents at the grocery, and then you get it back when you return it, which at first I was like, this is annoying because I'm lazy and I just want to throw it in the recycling bin and not have to take it to a special place. And I'm like, this is annoying. I bet it doesn't even work. These people are even too liberal for me, and for your listeners, I would say I'm center-left. And I was like, these people are too liberal. This is ridiculous. And then I actually did some research, and it's like 90% effective. And I was like, fine, I stand corrected. I will give you my bottle. But yeah, so it's environmentalism out here is very big. Like my apartment runs on renewable energy just through the power company, which is cool because when I've lived in the South, for example, that region, that was a lot harder to get.
Yeah,
so I don't know.
I want to say my experiences with the South. I lived in Kentucky and North Carolina, and I don't consider them the Deep South. So I don't really know what the real Deep South is like. Now I did go to Atlanta and Savannah, so I have that experience. But yeah, most of the time I spent living.
South is very interesting.
I lived in Raleigh and Lexington, so that's not quite the same level. Well, we met some people here in Indiana who were from Alabama, and they would point out that Kentucky isn't the South. So,
I think that's funny because I lived in Kentucky as well, and I also lived in North Florida. And if you've ever been to North Florida or the state of Florida, you know that the more north you go, the more south you get in terms of culture.
Right.
And it's interesting because people down there would agree and say Kentucky's not the South, but then in my mind I'm like, if I can see like the remnants of like slave quarters, like you were the South. So
well, then that puts Missouri squarely in the South.
Well, there you go. But
South, I don't know. It's a tough thing for states like Kentucky and West Virginia because they're border states, and Maryland too.
They are. Yeah.
They don't really they're switch hitters. They can be either side they want to be, I suppose.
That's true. Yeah, I think the South in general, that area in general, the politics, the culture, I think it's very fascinating because I see a lot of different. I think a lot of people stereotype the South as conservative, rural, uneducated, backwards type,
Right, and that's not 100% true. It's very deep. I would say it's deep rooted in some kind of, I don't know how to describe it. There's more of an aura around it, or a deeper kind of spiritual connection for them with certain beliefs and values. Whereas this is actually really interesting. I was in one of my church meetings with one of my elders, and this is really funny. So we were both talking about this same passage in the book, and the writer was from Minnesota. I said, "Oh, I totally identify with this writer. I know exactly what he's talking about." And the guy who disagreed with me, who's from here, which I'm in the southern part of Indiana, so it's more like the Ohio River Valley, you know. And he was like, "Oh, well, that sounds very stoic and nihilist." And he said that sounds very much like Wisconsin or Minnesota. So I guess we're just totally removed from any kind of... We're very stoic people, in the
That's
Midwest.
Interesting.
Yeah. I thought it was an interesting contrast, because I do kind of see it that way. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Like, my grandfather worked in the same factory building tractors for 30 years and retired and sold his company stock. And that, to him, is eking out a great existence. That's the dream, right? You know, and other places in the country, people would be like, "Oh, I would never want to be tied down like that," you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. I had my grandfathers were similar, sort of, at least in the trajectory. They lived in southwestern Pennsylvania, and they were coal miners. And they did, the 30, 40 years or whatever, and then the pension, retirement, that version of the American dream. And that was, like, golden. Like, that was good. Right. But other people, like, I wouldn't be a coal miner. You know what I mean?
I don't think, and this is what I mean, right, when I kind of talk about this, because that was the sort of Great Lakes culture thing, and I think that's dead. And I'm not saying everybody needs to go back to that, but, and I'm not even sure we can go back to that, mind you, but it feels like that was, right. I don't know, I see that as almost the heart of America, right? And I don't know, it's definitely different now, and it kind of makes me sad. I'm very nostalgic, I'll admit it. My other grandfather, my dad's parents, they were Ward and June Cleaver. I mean, seriously.
Oh,
really? He fought in World War II, came back and took over his father's commercial insurance business. And she was involved in all the local clubs and put on all these parties at the house. And my dad was the youngest of 5 children.
Oh my goodness!
All boys. And
yeah, oh my goodness.
That's like 1950s America in a nutshell.
That's literally, yeah. That's amazing. That's so funny. I think you're right, though. I think it is dying, and I don't think it's just dying in your region of the country. I think it's dying across the country for a few different reasons, obviously. And a lot of it is just the world has changed. Technology has disrupted a lot and changed our workforce and our economy. And, it's more of a services and information economy now. And that's definitely the trajectory that I see us taking. That's not to say that you won't have the need for, like, manufacturing or mining coal or whatever, those quintessential, like, post-World War II industries were. But I definitely see a shift in the landscape, and I think the idea of a lot of us, especially in our generation, finding a company we stay with for 30 years and then retire off of, I think that's just completely dead.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, so I would like to see, though, that sort of I think on the national stage, I think people could take more cues from the Great Lakes and learn that it's okay to have swings and trends, and that there can be ground rules for everybody, and people can live next to each other, and it's okay, and I don't know. I don't know how you get that across to certain types in leadership. I know a lot of people are critical of Paul Ryan, but I actually do see him as mellow compared to a lot of other people.
It's that's funny you bring him up as the example.
Right.
Because he's not my favorite person.
Right.
I mean,
I actually disagree with his politics as well, but
yeah,
for everybody who doesn't know, I'm very strongly libertarian, so.
There's a lot about his policy in his policy positions that I do not like, but on a human level, and I'm sure I would get flack from saying this from a few people that come to mind, but I read the book Janesville, and I'm on the author, but it's a good book if anyone out there needs a book, and I gained a newfound sympathy for him and his attempts to try to save that town and that region during the recession. So it's interesting that you used him as the example, because I was one of those people that was like beating my drum against him.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just it's hard, So to kind of sort of sum it all up and bring it home, like I said, I don't want to keep you forever, but this has been very great and entertaining. I'm sure this will be very productive. I see it as the Great Lakes culture needs to make a comeback. That it was good. It was good in its peak, and maybe it won't be quite the same in the future. I see hope sometimes when I see sort of things that are happening in places like Milwaukee and Pittsburgh and even Detroit. Bless its heart, Detroit. So heavily invested in one industry.
Yeah, sure is.
And I see hope sometimes, but I really just think people could look to what's gone on in the Great Lakes over the years and say, hey, maybe we want to go back to that in some ways. Maybe we want to. I don't know. I'm very nostalgic. Okay, I will admit I'm very nostalgic, but
you're making me feel nostalgic, and I've not even experienced this way of life. That's so interesting.
People say I have that effect on people, but I just think it's possible for people to live in a community where there's the rich people, there's the poor people, but it doesn't have to be very confrontational.
Sure.
And there's all kinds of different people. I don't know how to describe it. It's okay. I guess if I can sum this all up and how I feel about the Great Lakes, my grandfather doesn't lock his car doors, and just drives around town. Everybody knows who he is. He has more money than some people, but, he does volunteer sometimes too, but he doesn't do it to be seen volunteering either. Like, he told me the story where he just, he was at the high school career fair. Why he was at the high school career fair, I don't know, because obviously I'm not in high school in Wisconsin. But he was there, and he met some guy, and he said, hey, man, I know at my old company they're hiring people for CNC technicians, and not a lot of people know how to do that. You should learn how to do that. And he met the guy 5 years later, and now the guy makes $20 an hour doing that. So,
wow.
But he never
awesome.
did some formal thing, And it was like there was a big fight in my parents' hometown about fixing up their boardwalk out to their lighthouse. And I said, why don't people just go out there and pour the concrete themselves, And a bunch of people liked it when I said that. But I think that attitude needs to make a comeback. And I don't know what I have to do to start it, but I guess I've started with one person already, so...
That's exactly it. And it's not like a great answer, because obviously I'm a millennial and I like quick fixes, just like the next millennial. But it's not a quick fix. It's exactly what you said. It's communication with your community and just building it from the ground up over time. Honestly, that's the best way to do it and to have it have staying power. Again, not the sexiest answer, but it's the truth. That's how it's done. And it's literally these one-on-one conversations or your listeners listening to this and then replicating those types of conversations in their communities.
Yeah, so, in closing, everybody go look at how great Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and parts of Ohio and Pennsylvania are. Shoot for that. Minus the population loss.
Nice.
Yeah, so, thanks for coming on, and, you can check out Sarah on the Dove Party, and you guys are starting up again in April.
We are, yes. We will be back with new episodes and even more corny jokes in April, and you can check us out on www.thedoveparty.com.
Cool, and, yes, my podcast is on... is Know Your Place podcast. I'm on SoundCloud. I'm also on iTunes. I'm also on Facebook. And I'm on YouTube. So, there you go. Yeah.
All the places.
All right. Well, you have a good one, and thanks for stopping by. Have fun in Oregon.
Thank you so much.
Person.
You enjoy the Great Lakes. Thank you so much for having me.
Check out the Know Your Place podcast on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word, or on Facebook at facebook.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word. And we will be coming soon to YouTube and iTunes, and maybe another social media platform near you. Special thanks to my wife, Sarah, and Jay Graff for the riff.